Chapter 39 to 40. Harry sighed but accepted it. He had some backup plans as well, which was why he said he needed a week to prep, but he'd hoped he'd be able to do it the easy way. However, the Ancient One continued, rather, you don't need to borrow it. As you have regained the use of portals, just tell me when you plan on performing the mind training and I'll come over and use the spell myself. Really? Of course. My main concern is that if young Wanda's mind enters your own, her body will be left undefended. The chosen vessel of Thawne should not be left empty so easily, even if only for a moment. Although unlikely, it would be prudent to ensure nothing happens, so I will be present to cast the spell and ensure nothing occurs. Harry let out a breath of relief and said, thank you. He had considered that as well, and many of the materials he intended to fetch were for that very purpose, but there was a difference between a week of prep and having the Sorcerer Supreme watch over you. Together they went over the various details and made a plan. Harry left Camartage by portal and spent the next 2 days sightseeing. The Mindscape copy perk allowed him to perfectly replicate areas into his mind, and since he was going to have a guest, he wanted to make sure she would not get bored. Harry spent a few hours as a snowy owl with a notice-me-not flying around New York and eventually got a copy of almost the entire city in his mind. He returned to human form and entered many of the places of interest to copy the interior as well, and visited every beach in 100 miles. Thankfully it was only August and the water was cool but not cold. Harry used a portal to visit several nearby forests and a lot of scenic areas. He made sure to copy the sky next to the beach when the sun rose, which, although not as great as a sunset, was still pretty good. After that, Harry used a portal to return to Tibet and used his fastest flying speed as an owl to fly directly to the mountains and copy them directly into his mind as well. He flew along the hiking routes and tourist sites and spots of interest. Last but not least, Harry used a portkey his godfather, Sirius Black, had handed him and used it to go to Black Island, his godfather's vacation island. Sirius wasn't there, which didn't surprise Harry as the married man was quite busy fixing the wizarding world. Last Harry heard, the man was going to be, against his will, elected Minister of Magic. After getting a copy of Black Island, Harry used a portal to return to the Institute. Something Harry liked about his new portals was that because he didn't have to swing his hand around to open one, he could make one even as an owl. Once things had settled down, he would take the time to visit every part of the world he could think of so he could copy the nice things into his head and be able to open a portal there when needed. The next week passed by mostly uneventfully as he followed his new routine except for one encounter. One morning when Harry woke up from his 4 hours of sleep, Jean telepathically conveyed to him, "You actually died? You said it got better." Harry smiled. He wondered how she would react to that one. He thought back, "You saw the stuff after that, right? It did get better." "Well, I mean, yeah, but you died. Usually you don't come back from that." Harry thought back, "Didn't you come back from death a little before that?" Jean's shock could be heard through her thoughts. "How did you know about that?" "A little birdie told me." "Keep reading, Jean, it's all there." Harry could swear he heard a sigh before she conveyed back, "Alright, but I'm skipping the endless video games and TV time. I feel a bit weird reading the personal stuff about your parents, so I'll be skipping that." "That's fine. Skipping the whole tutorial won't change my story much." "What? No way. This gamer stuff is actually pretty interesting. Can you really respawn if you die?" "Yeah, but other than using it as a tasteless prank, I'd rather not demonstrate that." "What kind of prank would require that?" Harry sent a visualization of himself having a serious conversation with someone he didn't like and then exploding in a shower of gore in front of them, leaving the poor victim destined to require endless therapy for the rest of their days. Jean sent back, "Yeah, that would be pretty tasteless." Jean and Harry continued to chat about various subjects, both strange and mundane. Jean finished reading about the tutorial and started into Hogwarts on Friday. The following Saturday morning, Rogue went looking for Harry, and after finding him leaving the kitchen, she grabbed him and gave him a giant hug. Harry hugged her back, of course, and when she released he asked, "Not that I mind, but what was that about?" Rogue smiled back and said, "Cody Robbins. The boy who I put into a coma. I found out he woke up." Harry smiled back and said, "That's great. The connection between you two has been severed, so there wouldn't be any lasting effects." Rogue nodded and looked down for a moment before gently asking, "Were you planning on doing anything today?" Harry honestly answered, "Well, I was planning on spending a 100-year-long vacation with a girl I met for the first time last weekend so I could help her learn to control her own powers." Rogue looked more than a little flabbergasted at that, and Harry added in jest, "Why, did you want to join us?" Rogue froze for just a moment and nodded, "Yes, I wanna go." Harry did a double take and asked, really? It's 100 years, you know. She has some issues that can only be resolved with time, so I'll be using magic to accelerate time and put 100 years of training and experiences in her head to help her out. Rogue looked a bit pensive and replied, well, I need training too. I've already asked most of the X-Men to lend me their powers, but using them with each other is gonna take me a long time to master. Can I practice as well if I were to go too? Harry considered it and determined that she would in fact be able to use her powers in his mindscape. Time would be slowed but not halted, meaning the connections she had to others would not be interrupted. That meant she could also practice the use of her powers. Harry was not one to go back on his word, so he asked for confirmation. Are you absolutely sure? You won't be able to quit halfway through, you know. Rogue nodded with certainty. I'm sure. Harry let out a sigh and said, alright, wait in your room and I'll call for you in 2 hours. Rogue smiled and hugged Harry again before heading into her room. Harry wondered if she knew what she was getting into, but figured it would be alright. Although Harry wouldn't be able to kick her out if she got tired of it, he could freeze her mind until the time ran out, so there was no real harm if she wanted to come along. Giving Wanda some female company wouldn't be a bad thing either, since they had a number of things in common. Harry stopped for a moment and considered inviting Jean, but decided against it. The faster she removed the seals on the Phoenix, the better, and spending 100 years training with a locked mind would not do her any favors in the long run, because she would not be able to unlock her own mind while it was in Harry's. There were a few variations he could try that might help, but after going over them one by one, Harry determined it still was not to her benefit to be included in this. Once more, Harry was driven over to the mental institute with Xavier and Logan. Harry considered telling Xavier he needed a few minutes alone with Wanda for his plan to work, but he could not think of a way to ask that of him without Xavier jumping to the wrong conclusion. Instead, he decided to wisely remain silent and explain the details when they got there. The group went through the same procedure as before, with one difference. One of the doctors showed up to meet Xavier and stated that Wanda seemed to have shown great improvement in the last week. Harry loudly thought a message to Xavier that he wanted imparted to the doctor. Xavier complied and told the doctor they had a breakthrough last week and he should expect even greater improvements very soon. The doctor looked both skeptical and interested. A wait-and-see approach. They returned to the small room from before, and 10 minutes later, Wanda entered. This time the door didn't melt. When she saw Harry had actually come, she looked like she was going to cry as she couldn't believe he had actually returned to fulfill his promise. Harry hugged her again, which she enjoyed this time, and Harry said to Xavier, this could either take 3 minutes or up to 10 minutes depending on the resistance her powers puts up, but I have confidence that when finished, it will become manageable. That being said, it would be better to have a bit of privacy. Thankfully Xavier didn't take it the wrong way and agreed, leaving the pair alone and closing the door. He was probably satisfied by hearing Wanda's progress. Harry knew of course that spending a week with a loving corgi you didn't have to feed or clean up after would do wonders for any grumpy person. Harry created an illusion of Wanda sitting cross-legged and Harry sitting behind her with his hands against her back in what looked like some kind of treatment. That was to be used if anyone opened the door's viewing window and peered through. Harry then transfigured Wanda's jacket into a red long coat with a t-shirt and jeans beneath it. To the side, Harry opened a silver portal and walked through. Wanda followed behind into what appeared to be a ritual chamber. Harry then opened another portal which showed Rogue's room. She looked shocked at the silver doorway, but upon seeing Harry on the other side, didn't hesitate to jump in. A moment later, the robe-wearing, shaved head, ancient one walked in and said, hello friends of Harry, I'm his teacher, and I'll be helping out with this little project. Harry stated, thanks again for agreeing to assist. This is Wanda and Rogue. Rogue asked for training as well and will be coming along. That way Wanda will have some female company. Rogue introduced herself and Wanda reciprocated. Rogue also asked if she could use Wanda's powers, and Wanda, not really knowing what to say, answered yes and got a light finger touch from Rogue. She figured if Harry was going to train Wanda, then if Rogue could use her powers, she could get training as well. Harry said, we don't have much time, so please sit down in the center and we'll start. The ritual room was perhaps the most magically guarded room in Camartage and used to both prevent entry and exit. Harry could only create a portal into it because he had a key. Otherwise the room was rather impregnable. Of course it was overkill for what they had in mind, as they were not actually performing a ritual, but neither had a problem with overkill when it came to placing safeguards against an elder demon god of chaos. Wanda and Rogue sat down in the middle of the room. Had they actually been performing a ritual, there would have been lines of candles and stuff, but all of that was placed at the side, so the room looked more like a storage room in a church than it did a place where mortals formed connections to that which was better left untouched. Harry concentrated his psionics and connected to both Wanda and Rogue. Rogue accepted the connection, and after a moment, Wanda did as well. Rejecting wouldn't have been difficult, but both knew Harry didn't have any bad intentions. This was a variation on the Ancient One's trick of pushing the astral form out of a body and directly into the astral plane. Harry could not do that, but he could drag a person's astral form into his own mind if he wasn't blocked. Once he successfully pulled both Rogue and Wanda into his library, he signaled for the Ancient One to cast the spell. After making several hand signs, the center of the eye she wore opened and the time stone within was revealed. A wave of green light shot out towards Harry and the girls as the spell was cast. Although the Ancient One had never let Harry use the Eye of Agamotto, he knew what it really was. It was a common misconception that the eye was a tool that used the time stone to manipulate time. It was not. The time stone doesn't need assistance to manipulate time. What the eye actually did was hide the stone and limit its power. When the eye was closed, Harry could not feel the time energy contained within even if he stood next to it. Even when opened, the time energy that should have rushed out like an endless sea was reduced to a meager trickle. Of course, it was possible to override those limits and safeties and use the full power of the time stone with the eye, but doing so wouldn't be any different from broadcasting to the whole of the universe that there is an infinity stone present and invite those who sought them out to come and take them. All magic had a price after all, the use of the eye was no different. Wanda and Rogue found themselves in Harry's library, and Harry himself materialized within and said, "Welcome to my head. Please leave all questions until after the tour." Harry showed them to a door which opened to reveal a round room that contained many silver portals. These were imitations of Harry's portals and a setup that others wandering around his head could use to go into the different areas. Harry showed the portals for New York, London, Tibet, Hogwarts, the tutorial village, Black Island, and many scenic areas such as grasslands, beaches, forests, and mountains. He took them to New York, which looked identical to the real thing, and stopped at a coffee shop where Harry ordered tea and asked what the girls wanted. Wanda asked for hot chocolate and Rogue asked for a muffin. Moments later the waitress came over with their orders and a check, and Harry began drinking his tea and said they could start with their questions. Wanda started, "Is this real?" Harry smiled and said, "Depends on your definition of real." Rogue asked, "Is it like the Matrix?" Harry considered it and answered, "Somewhere between the Matrix and a video game. The people around us are NPCs. Please treat them as you would real humans." Wanda asked, "Why?" Harry replied, "Habits. We'll be here for a while, and if you treat them as anything other than real people, you may find it difficult to treat actual real people as real people when we leave. Consider it practice." Rogue looked at the check that the waitress left and asked, "How will we pay?" Harry handed both girls a wallet which contained an ID card, credit card, and library card. Harry's library card could not be taken by someone who would use the information gained from his mind poorly, so he waited to see if both could claim it and was more than a little relieved that they both took it without issue. Had they been unable to take the card, his training sessions would have been far more awkward. Harry said, "Again, the act of paying is just because we're going to be here a while, and if you spend 100 years going to a coffee shop without paying, you might forget to pay in real life." Wanda was still looking around and having trouble accepting that something so real was literally all in their heads. Harry got out some folders and passed them out before stating, "Now although we have 100 years, that doesn't mean you can do nothing the whole time. Again, if you spend 100 years doing nothing, you'll find it hard to get motivated to do something back in the real world. So we are going to keep busy. Here are your schedules." Both opened the files and they had what looked similar to a school schedule. Neither felt this was going to be fun. Harry's first goal was to help Wanda catch up on her studies and basically teach them both until they had nothing else they wanted to learn. Wanda wasn't thrilled, but Harry basically explained that the entire point of this, in addition to making use of the valuable time, was to keep her mind occupied for so long, she basically forgets to think about how much she hates her father. Wanda accepted such a feat would truly take a long time and decided not to argue with it. The first thing that Wanda discovered which surprised her was that her powers worked just fine in the mindscape, and when she got angry, her powers reacted the same way. Although the people she hurt were not real people and the places she destroyed were not real places, they still looked and felt real. Harry also insisted that the damage done be left as is, and when she mastered her power she could use those locations to practice repair magic later. Harry could have fixed it himself of course, but having damage done vanish as if it never happened without her own input was not realistic, and Harry didn't want them to get used to the idea that things they broke would fix themselves later. The reason Harry had to put so much effort into logic was to ensure that logic was correctly imprinted into Wanda's head. If a user of chaos magic could not tell the difference between fantasy and reality, things would go downhill fast. Harry's answer to this was for them to consider the possibility that everything was fantasy, but regardless, treat it as if it were reality. As long as Wanda treated everything like reality, even knowing it could be fantasy, she would not be able to unconsciously trick herself otherwise. Of course, as was the same with reality, Harry was still unaffected by anything Wanda did, so he would often remain near her to remind her that she wasn't dangerous. At some point Rogue had taken Wanda to the side and they toured New York without Harry and spent many hours performing the dreaded girl talk. Harry did not in fact spend every moment monitoring the girls, so he would do his own thing when the pair went off on their own. Due to the fact that most malls, stores, and restaurants were either faithfully copied or at least imitated to the point they were functional, the pair would not be deprived of things to enjoy. Harry's own project for the next 100 years was something he had been considering since his decision to use gemstones and tech. Harry decided to invent a new branch of science. None of the current branches could properly explain extra-dimensional energies, and to avoid using the word magic, Harry had to properly formulate the observable reactions of these energies which could be reproduced by others. Of course, the observability of such energies would require technology which didn't exist yet. Harry would make it eventually, and when he did, people would be able to measure energies from other dimensions and learn how they interact with different fields and materials. Harry had something of an innate understanding of the energies already, but he needed something that could be taught to others and tested using machines. Of course, the only materials capable of interacting with these energies naturally would either be rare and esoteric materials like vibranium, or the gemstones Harry's company would alter using sonic technology. As long as no one else cracked material manipulation using sonic tech, Harry's company would have the monopoly on the source of all materials needed for what would soon be the world's most advanced tech. The reason Harry needed to write out the science though was because he needed the science behind his tech to be understood by others so it could be approved of and sold. It was fine if others knew how his stuff worked and how to make it themselves. Unless they got the key materials from Harry's companies, they could only twiddle their thumbs. Of course there would be those who tried to buy large amounts of products containing those specialty materials in order to use them to build devices of their own designs, but Harry had his own plans, or should he say, pranks for such people. In addition to basic and advanced subjects, Harry taught both girls occlumency. Chaos magic was close enough to wizard magic for Wanda to use it, and since Rogue could use both Wanda's powers or Jean's powers, she could use them to build up her own occlumency as well. Harry also encouraged both to acquire a hobby. Both tried cooking but both decided it didn't agree with them. Wanda decided to try painting and found she liked it, while Rogue took up reading and playing video games, much to Harry's amusement. When Rogue got bored, she would fight the copies of monsters Harry faced in battle meditation, or she would fight Death Eaters. It hadn't taken her long to find Harry's life story, the one Jean had been reading in his library, and after a few weeks she finished the whole set, catching up to Harry's present. Harry noticed that once finished, Rogue would often go find the copies of the various foes Harry had defeated, such as the monsters from his battle meditation or the Death Eaters or that basilisk. When she was feeling adventurous, she would try facing the Black Dragon and die a noble death against it. She once complained to Harry that she wanted to face Voldemort or the Mandarin, but Harry said that Goose technically killed the former and Harry barely survived the latter, so his mindscape copy didn't have enough information to reproduce them. When channeling the powers of others, there were some powers she could channel completely and other powers that she could only use a fraction of. She could use 100% of the Juggernaut's strength, but she could only teleport a fraction of Kurt's max distance. She could use Bobby's power without issue, but Evan's spikes were uncomfortable to use and less effective compared to when she stole his powers. Scott's power was ironically rather easy to use, but Logan's was a bit moody. In order to use Logan's healing factor, she had to heavily focus on using it, which prevented her from multitasking while healing. Harry determined the difficulty was based on the origin of the power. Scott's, Bobby's, and Marco's powers seemed to all be extra-dimensional. She was just connecting to the same extra-dimensional source, using them as a reference. Kurt's teleporting was something Harry suspected was influenced by his bloodline, something Rogue did not share with Kurt. Spike and Wolverine both manifested their powers from their own biology, meaning Rogue's body had to mimic their cells, which was harder than channeling energy. Harry suggested practicing with Mystique's power, as getting used to the feeling of her cells changing should help use the powers of others. Rogue found that if she shapeshifted into Logan, Kurt, or Evan, using their power was much easier. But she wanted to use her power in her own form, so that became her goal for practicing. With Harry's help, Rogue also practiced chaos magic. Wanda didn't particularly like her powers, so Rogue helped Harry figure out the properties of it so Harry could create a proper training routine when Wanda finally came around. 5 years after entering the mindscape, Harry called Wanda over and told her, "It's time to practice the use of your power." Wanda frowned at that and asked, "Why now?" Harry asked, "When was the last time you thought of your father, and when was the last time your anger caused an accident?" Wanda thought about it and realized it had actually been a full year. Clemency hadn't been easy to learn, but she had eventually used it to do as Harry said and removed her father's ability to infuriate her. Harry was right about that, he wasn't important enough to be allowed to affect her life so much. Wanda looked at the painting she had been working on and said, "I just want to learn how not to hurt people. The only person I want to use my powers to tear up is my father, but since there is only one of him, I don't see much of a point in training to use my power in other ways." Harry sighed, but it wasn't his decision to make. If someone wanted to live a peaceful life, that was their choice. Rogue heard about her decision later and took her out for some more girl talk. When they returned, Wanda agreed to get trained and do everything she could to become stronger. Harry wasn't going to ask what they talked about, but he was happy she made that choice. Thanks to trial and error with Rogue, Harry had created what he considered the perfect training regime for chaos magic. Much of it he created with his subconscious, as his mind contained both the Book of Vishanti and the Darkhold, the later being the premier text on all things chaos magic. Harry initially wanted to remove Thawne's signature from Wanda's magic and have her imprint it with her own. This would completely cut off Wanda's potential as the perfect vessel for Thawne, but Harry easily found out how impossible this was. It was not just a mark left on her by some remnant of Thawne, it was an actual piece of himself he personally placed in her at the moment of her birth. Through some testing, Harry determined that Wanda's mutant power should have been a form of energy manipulation. Thawne had likely seen this as the perfect opportunity and used it to change the energy she could manipulate from normal energy to chaos magic. Because of this, there was no way to change what she could manipulate from chaos magic to wizard magic. However, since Plan A wasn't viable, Harry decided to go with Plan B. If Thawne was going to give her a great talent and potential at manipulating chaos energy, then why not have her perfect it to the degree she should be able to overpower Thawne himself if she faced him? Of course, that didn't include facing him in his own realm, but outside of that, any version of Thawne she met would not be capable of absolute control over chaos energy. If Wanda's control could exceed or at least match whatever avatar of Thawne she encountered in the future, she would not be overwhelmed and would have a fighting chance. Of course, Harry would never intentionally allow her to confront Thawne, but there was no harm in planning for the worse. Harry's lesson plans for chaos magic was a step-by-step introduction on pretty much everything that chaos magic could do and an explanation of how it did it. Since most aspects of chaos magic were identical to wizard magic, Harry used that as a base. According to Harry, wizard/chaos magic was based on probability manipulation and reality overriding. For example, the basic unlocking charm. There was a set non-zero probability that someone would forget to lock a door. The unlocking charm set that probability to 100% and overlapped that with reality, thus causing the door to unlock itself in order to correct itself to a state where someone had forgotten to lock it. Without a lock that was enchanted to resist such an effect, the unlocking charm could potentially unlock any door that was capable of being unlocked. The key to using chaos and wizard magic was not manually searching for that probability when casting the spell, but allowing your feelings and instincts to guide you to that probability and use that as the target for overlapping reality with. Once Wanda got the hang of it, she took to chaos magic like a fish to water. It only took a few months to catch up to where Rogue had been, and after half a year, Wanda was the one teaching Rogue. The reason she was teaching was that Harry insisted on it. He plainly stated that few things allow someone to learn more about something than teaching it to someone else. By figuring out the best way to teach the less talented Rogue how to use chaos magic, she was getting a cleaner feel for it herself. After they had finished with their base schooling, their schedule changed to include daily outside vistas. Hiking trips, days in the city, walks along the beach, or even just making a bonfire in the woods. The girls started to really show how much they were enjoying spending time around Harry, and when someone enjoys being around you, it wasn't hard to enjoy being around them. 20 years after the start of their training, Wanda's skill at chaos magic officially surpassed Harry's skill with wizard magic. Wanda was capable of using an unlocking spell without any excess chaotic energy in the spell. This meant that Wanda could use the spell on an electronic lock without frying it and have it actually open. Even Harry couldn't do that. Harry's overall power was of course much higher, but his precision lost out to Wanda's. 50 years into the venture, Rogue and Wanda both asked to go on a date with Harry. By now Wanda had also read the books on Harry's life and they both knew he was in love with Jean, but they also knew they had fallen in love with him as well and knew the feelings were mutual. Harry was surprised that they stated they would be willing to share Harry with Jean, and Rogue stated that she knew for a fact that as long as Jean got enough love, she would be willing to share Harry as well. Wanda admitted that the only reason she worked hard to master her powers was because Rogue had told her that in the future, Harry would have many powerful enemies trying to control him and would need help to face them. Paying Harry back for everything he'd done for her was her motivation to become stronger. Harry had no way to argue with that and agreed to take both on some dates. Over the years they grew closer and he fell in love with them both. Though since all three were virgins, Harry had no frame of reference in his mind for going further than making out, which was fine for the girls. Harry stated he wouldn't cross that final line until he was 16 and they had moved out of the mansion. When asked why, Harry stated that Logan would definitely know every time they did it and Harry didn't feel comfortable with that. Rogue immediately agreed as Logan was basically the surrogate father figure for many of the students and the fact that he would know every time they got busy would kill the mood dead. Over the course of many years they learned that Harry had many flaws of his own. He had become over-reliant on pausing, and because he didn't pause this whole time, he would often spend too much time thinking over a trivial issue or would remain indecisive about something which should be a straightforward choice. Harry had never had an outsider's perspective look at him for some long and until then had remained unaware of those issues, and Harry resolved himself to get better about those issues. At the end of the 100 years, the trio found themselves back in the ritual room. Ping. Scholar Path has risen to rank 45. Rogue looked around and asked, "Is it over?" The Ancient One answered back, "Yes indeed." Rogue and Wanda both walked over to the Ancient One and gave a bow before saying together, "Thank you for taking care of Harry." She nodded back with a smile and said, "You're welcome to visit the sanctum in the future. But now, it's best you were off." The trio nodded and headed off. The portal to Rogue's room and the mental institute were still open, so they left and the portals closed. Wanda took a look around the small room and waved a hand to dispel Harry's illusion of the pair that had remained. She took a deep breath and then dispelled the transfiguration on her straitjacket, which coiled back around her, binding her arms in place. She was fully capable of removing the jacket at any time. She was also fully capable of teleporting using her own version of apparition, and no locked door could hold her. Due to all this, she could leave any time she wanted to. Harry however insisted she take the time to consolidate her own mind and feel out her powers before rushing to use them at the level she could towards the end of the 100 years. Before opening the door to let Xavier back in, Wanda gave Harry a pleading puppy dog look he had grown so used to over the years and lifted her up to give her a passion-filled goodbye kiss. Technically this was his first kiss not in the mental plane, and Harry didn't have any complaints about it. When Xavier entered and saw the pair, he had to do a double take on Wanda to make sure it was the same girl. Xavier had an innate passive sense of empathy and could feel many layers of emotions off the various people around him. The Wanda in front of him was a completely different person than the woman behind the door 5 minutes ago. Harry smiled at his shocked expression and said, "Complete success, Professor." Wanda nodded and said with a light smile, "He's right, there won't be any more uncontrolled outbursts or accidents." Xavier smiled at her confidence and said, "I cannot tell you how pleased I am to hear that. As long as that proves true, I can promise that you will only remain here for another month or 2 for observation before you will be released." Wanda nodded and replied, "That's fine. I've got all the time in the world ahead of me, so a month or 2 won't kill me." The guard listening in couldn't believe what he was hearing. He was also having trouble seeing the smiling girl in front of him as the same teen who had nearly set him on fire half a dozen times over the last few months. He would be more shocked later when he received an apology from Wanda for her behavior and a genuine thank you for helping her. The remaining staff who would receive the same apology would be just as surprised. Over the course of the next 2 months Harry had 2 projects to complete. The first was the typing of what would later become textbooks for his new branch of physics, metaphysics. Technically, the current definition of metaphysics was considered a branch of philosophy without ties to actual reality. Harry intended to change that. Sure, he could have gone with extra physics or outer physics, but this term would be used to quantify the abilities of metahumans, so he'd rather use this and have others change the definition of metaphysics than use a term that made superhumans look alien. Harry's second project required a weekend spent at one of his companies assembling the world's first sonic screwdriver. There was a lot of overlap in the 2 projects, and the coding required to make the screwdriver was only possible after Harry had assigned the needed constants, variables, and formulas associated with the various energies that the machine would be dealing with. Now it wasn't actually a screwdriver, nor could it fit in the palm of a hand or a pocket. In fact, it was the size of a semi-truck and could only use nonlinear sonic oscillation harmonics to change the material physics of gemstones and only gemstones. But the properties that could be gained by gemstones that had undergone sonic treatment were non-reproducible through any other means on the planet. The first batch of treated gemstones were emeralds Harry would take back to the Institute. Harry had shown the goblins the step-by-step requirements for assembling the machines, and Harry's scholar path shined through in that he could perfectly teach them how to properly assemble and use it in a single weekend. The emeralds were the key to Harry's second project, his hard light hologram disguises for some of the students. The reason that only the Danger Room had a hard light platform was that the unique materials required to create the hard light system obtained from the Shuriar-designed spaceship were all used up in its creations. These modified emeralds, however, could act as replacements for the core components of a hard light generation platform which couldn't be acquired anywhere else on Earth. In addition to creating hard light disguises for the kids, Harry also intended to install a hard light platform in Forge's classrooms. A number of his demonstrations and labs required assistance, and he never had enough helpers for that, so Harry wanted to have his lab generate them for him. Harry already obtained permission from Danger herself to install a quantum entanglement connection from the Danger Room to Forge's classroom so Danger could act as an assistance. Forge could also reproduce material-intensive experiments through a hard light demonstration rather than burn through funds to redo the same experiment over and over. After a month and a half, Wanda Maximoff was successfully released from the mental institution and enrolled into Xavier's school. Wanda's release was expedited through several donations made to the institution as praise for successfully healing such a profound case. Not that Xavier was aware of that. Harry wasn't going to leave it to chance, and he ensured Wanda's progress report leaked and that the doctors got lauded mountains of praise, which in turn made them want to show off her success even more, which in turn led to more donations. Her release had a nice, fat donation to tie the whole thing together and also sped up a process that should have taken 6 months to a quarter of that. Because of Rogue's power, she always had her own room, but when Wanda arrived, she immediately kidnapped her for a roommate, which Xavier was happy with. He had noticed both Wanda and Rogue's personalities had changed drastically, but there were changes for the better and both involved Harry Potter, though Xavier was unaware of the details. Harry used some precise magics to recreate some of the artwork Wanda had been most proud of from the 100 Years. Not all of her favorites though. Wanda was explicit that some of those works were meant for their own enjoyment and not for the eyes of others. One of the larger changes to Harry's personal schedule since then was that he would now spend 8 hours a day in bed instead of 4, but he only slept every other day. He would spend either 8 hours or 4 hours each night using battle meditation, which he had been slacking on lately due to lack of time. The reason was that both Wanda and Rogue had expressed interest in using the multiplayer function, so Harry agreed to use it when he reached level 220. However, at his current rate of about a level every 2 days, they would likely have to wait until December. He was almost to level 200 at the moment. Harry Potter level 199 age 15 STR 275 AGI 310 INT 450 WIS 410 LUK 20 Warrior Path rank 27 Scholar Path rank 45 Magic Path rank 40 Tech Path rank 32 Business Path rank 22 Crafting Path rank 23 Dragon Path rank 6 Psionic Path rank 20. Harry often had to resist looking at his stats and paths because it was too easy to distract himself from his current projects. Sure, he wanted to get his Warrior Path, Dragon Path, and Psionic Path to rank 30, but they would not grant any great assistant in a fight. Although his Dragon Path gave him enough strength to break the old Danger Room, if he wasn't holding back, he could do even more with strength energy. And of course anything he could do with brute force, he could do even better with spells. The so-called unstoppable juggernaut against Harry's magic was completely defeated after all. Both Wanda and Rogue agreed to keep their relationship with Harry a secret until Jean was on board. They wanted Harry to spend the nights cuddling with them, but in a house with a prankster teleporter, 2 telepaths, and a man who could smell what you had for breakfast yesterday on your breath, keeping such a thing a secret was impossible even with magic. Harry made it up to them though by setting a few adamantium plates inscribed with Time Lord math into their closet to enlarge the space inside by 10 times. Since it used block transfer computation instead of an undetectable extension charm, there was no exotic energy within, so it was safe for tech. Wanda quickly started back up on her art in her free time, and Rogue occasionally went to the mansion's game room and destroyed anyone who went up against her. How she suddenly became a god of games was something no one could understand. The Halloween of the year was on a Wednesday, and though many were too old to trick or treat, no one had the heart to stop them. Especially Kurt, Josh, and a few of the other kids who would not earn a second glance this night except for someone shouting they had an awesome costume. Wanda and Rogue dragged Harry out to have fun as Jean had just turned 16 and had volunteered to babysit her niece and nephew for their first trick-or-treat with her parents. Scott had stayed at the mansion to supervise a Halloween party, but Harry's girlfriends did not want Harry's first Halloween in the States to be dull, so they took him out to see the sights and decorations. Wanda's costume was a cute witch's outfit complete with a wide brim hat and toy broom. Rogue wore a vampire outfit with a cape and fake fangs. Harry's outfit was chosen by the girls. He wore a fur vest and had a blonde wig with a large prop bastard sword tied to his back, making him Conan the Barbarian, the hero of some of the world's oldest stories which may have been true. The trio were on their way to view more Halloween decorations when a fireball flew past them and a certain teen with a near Australian accent shouted, "I must be getting rusty to miss at this range." Although Harry wasn't a speedster, his observation and information processing speed was far superior to a normal human. When Pietro Maximoff ran down the block and right up to him, Harry's eyes followed him easily enough. It was too dark for the silver-haired teen to notice that as he ran past Harry and nabbed the belt Harry wore containing all his gemstones. Pietro stopped next to the ones Harry recognized as Lance and John. Off to the side were two he did not recognize but had heard of. A scrawny lad crouched on a wall with larger than normal eyes was the one called Toad. Next to him, a teen nearly as wide as he was tall, was Blob. Of course, Pietro, Lance, and John were called Quicksilver, Avalanche, and Pyro respectively. "Oh, look what I got. Emeralds, and diamonds, and rubies, oh my, ah ha ha ha." Pietro noticed Harry and Rogue in costume, but he hadn't taken a second look at the witch currently glaring at him. Pietro shouted, "Not so tough without your shinnies, pay to play." Harry shook his head with a smirk and said, "I doubt you're going to believe me, but I'll go ahead and say it. This is the part where you should be running away." The group paused for a moment before they each reeled back and started laughing. Pyro flicked his lighter and created a fireball while calmly asking, "And why would we do a thing like that? I've got you right where I want you and it's payback time." Rogue coughed loudly to get their attention as she was already getting peeved that she was not being taken as a threat. Lance turned to her and said, "Check out our costumes, little Miss Runaway." The light from Pyro's fireball stretched over the group and revealed each of them were in their Brotherhood costumes and none had any exposed skin other than the face. They even appeared to be wearing gloves. Pyro laughed haughtily and remarked, "You're not gonna be able to touch a single hair off our heads." The group continued to laugh and walked closer, slowly encircling the group. Their laughter died with a single sentence. "Hello, Pietro." Wanda's voice was smooth and clear, the kind of voice Harry knew he could listen to every day for the rest of his life. It was also very distinct, and though the male Maximoff twin had not heard it in years, he instantly recognized it. Pietro's eyes widened in shock at horror once he got a look at the face hidden under that wide-brimmed witch's hat and he stuttered out, "W Wanda?" Wanda smiled at his terror and waved her fingers before him. Pietro's costume suddenly expanded and then twisted around him, wrapping him from head to toe and causing him to fall over. This froze the rest of the group. She then looked at Pyro's fireball and threw a bolt of red energy at it, causing the ball to explode in Pyro's hand, setting his gloves on fire and giving him actual burns and causing him to cry out in pain. He dropped his lighter and used his ability to snuff out the flame, but with a wave of Wanda's hand, Pyro's own clothes transformed the same as Quicksilver's and in a moment he was bound as well. Avalanche rose his hands up as if he were lifting a great mass with a poor posture and the ground started trembling. Wanda threw a half-dozen marbles from her pockets and with a wave of her hand, they transformed into chickens which landed in front of Lance. The Terrakinetic sneered at the chickens and once more began to make the ground quake. The moment it did though, the chickens simultaneously turned their heads to face Lance and shouted together, "BUHGOK." The chickens started flapping and flew over the trembling ground directly at Lance's face. When he realized they were aiming to peck out his eyes, he released his hold on the earth and started running, but the chickens were very fast. Blob started charging as well, but another 4 marbles thrown led to the immovable teen being surrounded by 4 wolves, each snarling at him with glistening teeth. Seeing the direction of the wind, Toad decided to exist, stage left. He was unable to avoid Wanda's attention however, and with a scarlet bolt of light, he was turned into a large toad that fell to the ground and gave a large croak before continuing to hop away. Harry watched the show with a smile. The marbles were a gift to Wanda from himself. They had a core of life force infused iron within a crystal sphere and were very easy to transfigure into live animals. They even had a timed port key to return them to her room if they ran too far off. Of course there were limits. When it came to conjuring or transfiguring animals, the closer the probabilities of that animal actually appearing at that location were to 0, the harder the spell was to cast. So it was easier to conjure a wolf than it was a rhino unless you were in Africa. The creature with the lowest probability of appearing hairy was able to transfigure something into was a mammoth. He couldn't conjure or transfigure something into a dinosaur. Neither could he conjure or transfigure something into a creature that has never existed on Earth like many of the creatures he faced in battle meditation. The screams of agony of Avalanche in the distance and the cries coming from Blob from the pain of being bitten and the fear he will really be devoured by wolves had Pietro and John panicking. Wanda walked up to the bound pair and said with a smile that was not a smile, "Hello brother, it's been a while. I'd ask you how you feel, but being bound and unable to move while surrounded by people you're afraid of and lacking any control over your life is something I know far better than you, so I won't bother to ask." Pietro started rambling, "Wanda, wait, please. It wasn't my fault, I didn't want to leave you there, but father didn't have a choice." Wanda's not a smile strained as she continued, "I will have some choice words for father next I see him. All it took for me to learn to control my powers was someone who wasn't afraid of me. Father, your self-proclaimed leader, was too much of a coward for that. I don't know how any of you can justify following that hypocrite." Wanda's hand rose menacingly over Pietro and she said, "Now, shall I start with you, or perhaps your friend?" Pietro cried out, "No no no, wait, please, I'm sorry." Wanda theatrically stopped herself and like a perfect actress appeared to be giving it some thought. She said, "Well, I'm not sure if I believe you. How about this? Let Rogue here touch you for a moment. If she feels you really are sorry, then I promise to let bygones be bygones. I'll forgive you and you won't have anything to fear from me." The sound of Blob screaming made Pietro quickly answer, "Yeah, sure, no problem." Rogue walked up to Pietro with a smile and bent down to touch his face. However, she stopped for a moment and said as if thinking aloud to herself, "Actually, I have some homework I gotta get back and finish, so I need to get back to the mansion fast." She then looked back at Pietro and sweetly asked with a smile, "Pietro Maximoff, can I use your power?" Pietro nodded and said, Yeah, anytime." Rogue touched his face for a moment with her ungloved hand and walked over to John and said, "Didn't you say I wouldn't be able to touch a hair of your head?" Wanda said, "So what should I do with you? Turn you into a pumpkin? Maybe set you on fire and disable your power? Oh, I know, I think I'll make you permanently bald." John had been getting more and more pale with each threat and at the last he shouted like a little schoolgirl, "No. Please no oh. Anything but the hair." Rogue said, "You know, we'll need to put out the pumpkins when we get home, can you offer him the same deal?" John noticed that Pietro didn't look winded when Rogue touched him and had he been thinking clearly, he would have thought more of that than simply it wasn't a bad choice. John ended up agreeing to give Rogue his own powers as well in the end. After touching his face and plucking a strand of hair out of pettiness, Rogue finished up and Wanda said to Pietro, "Next time you see father, tell the coward to walk the long way around me if he ever sees me and I'll consider leaving his punishment until a later date." Harry casually walked over to where Pietro had initially been bound and picked up the belt of gemstones he'd dropped at the time and put it back on. Harry bent down to him and said, "I remember you saying last time we met I was as crazy as your sister. Wish I'd asked you more about her then because I think I'm in love." Quicksilver, the fastest mutant around, froze at Harry's admission and a moment later, his eyes rolled back and he fainted. Rogue and Wanda smiled and Harry walked back up to the group and they headed out. Harry almost had to wipe a tear of pride from his eyes after witnessing the pair in action. Not from how they dealt with the Brotherhood, but because of their prank on Pietro and John. Harry had of course taught them his love of pranks over the course of 100 years and they had many pranks wars between them and were far more experienced than most when it came to the art of pranks. He was so proud of them. Of the Brotherhood's powers, Pietro and John's were the strongest, which was why Rogue had telepathically gone over this plan with Wanda before they started. Blob's was alright, but it was practically a weaker version of Juggernaut and Avalanche's powers were far too destructive. Of course they could have knocked them out and taken the power after asking the unconscious mutants, but Rogue stated that although the power was not affected, the effort was. She realized it took far more effort to use Mystique's and Juggernaut's power than it did any of the X-Men who consciously agreed to give her the use of their power. As for the Brotherhood themselves, they would be fine. The transfigured wolves and chickens had illusion spells on them which made the damage inflicted on them feel and look real. Blob would look covered in blood and be in a lot of pain, but when the spell ended, neither he nor Lance would have any wounds and eventually Toad would turn back to normal along with John's and Pietro's costumes. On the way back home, Harry had a bad feeling. Rogue and Wanda noticed it of course and they returned to the mansion wearily, but nothing unusual occurred. A number of the kids had returned as well and were comparing their loads of candy with one another. Kurt's pillowcase was the largest. He looked like a demonic Santa Claus carrying that thing on his back. Harry spent 4 hours sleeping and another 4 using battle meditation. However, in the middle of his session, the battle meditation broke and Harry saw an image of Jean being manhandled by men in suits and crying, calling out for help. Harry quickly left his room and went over to Xavier's door. Before he reached it, the door had opened and Xavier was on his way out with a worried frown. He noticed Harry and said, "You felt it as well then? I'm heading to Cerebro now to check on Jean." Without another word, the pair quickly descended the mansion levels and entered Cerebro. Xavier put on his helmet and searched for Jean's mind. The map of the world displayed by Cerebro would zoom in on an area then zoom out as if bounced off. It would zoom in again on a different area and then zoom out again. Xavier's frown deepened and he commented, "I cannot get a lock on her. She was going to stay at her parents' house, let's see what happened." The map zoomed in on New York and quickly to her parents' house, where both parents were standing at their door speaking with 2 others who from some of the images appeared to be police officers. Xavier zoomed in on the minds of the twins and more images surfaced, their memories of what had happened. Images of trick or treating and Jean's smile while in a princess costume. Then 4 strangers showing up and fighting against Jean. She fought back but was overwhelmed. The group ignored the twins and grabbed her and left. Harry's own glare at the men in the images turned to ice. Jean had been kidnapped. Xavier felt Harry's rage and said, "We'll find her, Harry." Harry said with steel in his voice, "You won't have to." He took out a diamond and made it glow in front of Xavier before making a portal and entering it. The portal led to the area Jean had been kidnapped. There were still a few police at the scene and damages caused from the fight, though most of it from the assailants. No one noticed Harry snooping around and no one noticed the red mandalas he conjured to scan the area. It didn't take long for Harry to determine the group of kidnappers had a teleporter. The problem, however, was that it was a psionic teleporter. Such people could create a map of shortcuts in their head and instantly travel from one to another in what would be mapped out as a zigzag route, though they would arrive instantaneously. However, Harry had no way to track such a teleporter. Harry paused to consider his options. First of all, why didn't he get a quest? A quest would include a map pointer which would let him track her down in minutes. Even on that orphan's quest there was a map pointer to the orphanage, which was why Harry snooped for and found the hidden transfer magic circle. Why not now? After a few considerations, Harry realized why. He had a way to track down Jean, but that method would have permanent consequences. Without a map pointer, he would absolutely use that method. Perhaps those consequences were not a bad thing, so he wasn't given a shortcut around them. If that was the case, there was no need to hesitate. Harry made another portal into Wanda and Rogue's closet. He wasn't going to go directly into their room no matter the emergency, though he did knock loudly on the closet door. Moments later Wanda opened the door and said with a bit of an edge, "This had better be good, Harry." Harry said, "Jean has been kidnapped, I need yours and Rogue's help to find her." From her own bed Rogue said, "Give me a minute." The pair got ready and Harry made another portal to the mansion's back area that was lined with trees. Harry already got out a backpack from his inventory while in the closet and filled it with materials so the cameras in the area would not see him using his inventory. Harry pulled out 5 large crystal spheres from his backpack and placed them in a circle. He then got out a large jar of pure, white sand and began to pour it while walking around the circle. Though the pour looked sloppy, Harry was using telekinesis to make perfect lines between the crystal spheres. After drawing out the pentagram for a base, Harry then poured out a dozen thinner, more intricate lines and symbols. The formation Harry was making used the same arithmancy as the designs of Cerebro. It was a psionic enhancer powered by magic set specifically to locate a specific mutant psionic. If Harry had any of Jean's blood, he would not need this, but he had been reluctant to ask that of anyone up to this point. He fully intended to get samples of everyone's later once this was over. Once the sand formation was aligned, Wanda began chanting and charging the crystals with her chaos magic. Although she had not seen such a magic circle before, she had spent decades studying rituals, so understood its use very quickly. Her own talent in art made her own rituals very precise and formidable, and the pair had many discussions on rituals and ritual magic. Harry sent Rogue a telepathic message of what to do and she agreed without issue. Once the charge was complete, Harry entered Rogue's mind and together they found the echo of Jean that would often let Rogue use her powers. Harry said to it, "Jean, your body has been kidnapped and is being hidden just like those kids at the orphanage. We're going to amplify your connection to find you through that connection." The echo of Jean looked surprised and then worried before giving a firm, conviction-filled nod. She knew what this meant, but it was a better alternative than being kidnapped. Within his own mind, Harry concentrated on the phoenix flame and its resonance. The echo of Jean did not react, but Wanda caught the feeling through the ritual as her K and activated the ritual. She directed her charged powers into Harry and into Rogue, which then entered and supercharged Jean's echo. The pentagram on the grounds lit up like the sun, but Wanda held her concentration, using her power to amplify the connection to Jean. The echo of Jean suddenly lifted into the air and a red glow surrounded it. The piercing cry of a phoenix echoed. Harry followed the resonance and opened his eyes. "I've got a lock." Harry swatted the air and opened a portal. On the other side was Jean, bound to a metal table and screaming. A metal helmet was strapped to her head. Harry jumped in and paused. He did his best to calm himself with the promise of what he was going to do. The room had 2 floors with an observation deck and a stairway up to it. No windows, but the number of vents on the upper wall suggested the location was underground. The people around him were dressed in lab coats and none of them seemed particularly interested in Jean's screaming. Especially the one standing next to her with the large needle that Jean was screaming at. Harry memorized the position of every person in the room and after unpausing, shot each with a stunner in under 5 seconds. Harry looked back through the portal and saw that both Wanda and Rogue were exhausted. He couldn't see through portals while pausing, so he had to enter before scouting. After every person in the room fell down, Harry ran over to Jean and transfigured the iron bands holding her down into clay and ripped them off without hurting her. Jean met Harry's gaze the moment she realized what happened and she wrapped her arms around him and started crying. Harry would have found the fact that he princess carried her after rescuing her while she was dressed as a princess a lot more ironic were the situation not so humorless. As he walked her over to the portal, he cast a gentle sleeping spell on her and handed her to Rogue, who could easily carry her using one of her powers. Harry said, "Take her to McCoy and clean up here please." "I'll clean up on this side." Harry had absolutely no emotion as he said the last line and as the portal closed while he remained on the other side. Neither Wanda nor Rogue questioned what he was going to do. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.